Number 9. Greythorn Crescent had the well-bred look of a house that knew the right people and never raised its voice. The steps were scrubbed to a discreet gleam. The brass letterbox had a reticent shine. The drawing room, revealed in layered lamplight, held its breath over bowls of pale hyacinths and the formal serenity of old satinwood. Even the rain, which set a lacquer on the square outside and made the plane trees hiss, seemed to fall in tone with the occasion. Mrs. Callista Arden, the woman at number 9, had summoned a select circle to view a portrait and to take a little cold supper. The portrait, mounted on an easel and angled away from the fire, had been unveiled with a crisp flick of silk earlier in the evening, and had occasioned just enough admiration. Callista, who had made a career of not entirely believing applause, moved through her guests with a quick, controlled ease that her hands belied. They were expressive hands, faintly blue-veined and restless, flicking the fall of her black chiffon, tracing a cigarette to life, abandoning it, then rescuing it again. "Your quarrels has done you proud," murmured Sir Bertram Lingfield, who produced plays as other men produced excuses. He stood with his back to the fire, in the way of men who have owned fireplaces, and studied the painted Callista, a profile in half-shadow, the mouth unsmiling but not unkind. Callista's secretary, Eleanor Mayhew, moved lightly between table and chair, seeing to the invisible festival of plates. The butler, Felton, appeared with quiet cups and disappeared with quieter plates. Mrs. Vi, the housekeeper, had been glimpsed earlier, and then, like her kind, dissolved into the house's bloodstream. Julian Quarles, who had painted the portrait, stood apart with a carefully careless posture and a glass he did not drink. He was a young man with a reputation for disliking reputations. His eyes went from the canvas to Callista, back to the canvas, as if measuring the untranslatable distance between canvas and subject. "It is not a likeness," said Miss Viola Dane too brightly. She was the youngest guest and had brought youth like a thin, dangerous scent into the room. Sweet, hungering, and quick to turn. "It is Callista, as the public prefers to remember her. Which is—" she lifted her shoulders. "An entertainment." "Entertainments," said Mrs. Verity Pollen, who wrote about society with a pen dipped in tea, "are an honourable trade, my dear. We do them or we buy them. Both require a certain delicacy of purse." Sir Bertram gave a soft, censorious cough. "Viola is studying to be subtle," he said. "She will get there if she stops signalling changes." Viola coloured, then laughed at once, admitting the hit with a small bow. She crossed to the portrait and looked up into the painted face. "It is very beautiful. Only, oh well, one cannot paint a voice." "Nor keep one," said Edmund Roke. He was a clean, lean man with a tie that knew what it was doing and a watch that had nothing to hide. His relationship to Callista was a fact about which no one had reached a consensus, and everyone had an opinion. He smiled at his own remark and added, "Don't frown, Callista. I meant the years will pilfer what they can. It is their right." "They may take what doesn't matter," said Callista. She did not smile. "The rest one can misplace for them." "Your sitter," Julian said, very mild, "did not misplace anything. She only concealed it. That is the painter's complaint and his advantage." Felton moved behind them with drinks. His passage drew a faint draught over the lampshade so that the room breathed. The rain in the square steadied. Under it, somewhere near the railings, a late taxi coughed and seemed ashamed. "And you, Major St. Clair?" Verity Pollen asked, turning on a sudden, cat-like interest to the man who stood near the door as if it might be called upon. "Do you approve? Military taste is said to favour oils that look like medals." Major Leonard St. Clair had the manner of a man who persisted. He looked worn under the eyes with a careful honesty that made some women kinder and some curious. "It is very fine," he said. "As a likeness, I have no say. I did not know Mrs. Arden then." He paused, and his gaze, which had been obedient upon the picture, moved to Callista and stayed there a fraction too long. Art makes a parade of truth, he added. Uniforms do the same. Neither must be questioned at close quarters. Spoken like a man who keeps a field glass in his umbrella stand, Verity drawled. How gloomy we are. She touched Callista's sleeve. My dear, if you do not perform again, society will find a way to put you on somewhere. It is intolerable to have a star behind a curtain. I have no intention of performing, Callista said. I have an intention of staying very still. Her eyes moved briefly, pointedly, to Edmund Roke's profile and then away. The movement was like a private message sent in a public language. Felton, passing with a dish of asparagus tips, seemed to hear it and did not react. There was the small noise of an envelope sliding from a low table to the carpet. Eleanor Mayhew, who had learned plot by osmosis, bent at once and recovered it, pressing it down beneath the ashtray. No one spoke of it. No one did not notice. Viola watched Eleanor's efficient hand with a consideration that shadowed her prettiness for a moment. Felton, Callista said very gently, Mr. Quarles will have a little more of the claret. She did not look at Julian as she said it. And then, perhaps, coffee. Very good, madam. Roke glanced at his watch as if measuring the grace of leaving. Sir Bertram established himself in an armchair from which he could be consulted without being obliged. The portrait in its deliberate angle reflected one lamplight in a gloss over Callista's painted shoulder. Major St. Clair counted something on his fingers, names perhaps, or regrets, and stopped. Do we never play games in this house? Viola asked suddenly. Some round or other to warm us. Verity, a game at letters, or prophecy. Prophecy is vulgar, Verity said. We prefer inference. It gives one a finer profile. Callista's smile moved and was gone. No games tonight. I'm tired. We will eat, and then you shall all go home and say the right things about the picture. She set her cigarette carefully in the tray as if laying down a pen. Felton? Yes, madam. Send word to Mrs. Vi. We will go in. Felton bowed and paused the briefest instant, not quite an obstruction at Eleanor's elbow. Eleanor, without turning her head, moved her hand to cover the envelope under the ashtray. It was an economical gesture, neither guilty nor innocent. Viola watched it with a small, involuntary intake of breath, and then, seeing herself observed, laughed and shook back her hair. Number 9 collected itself, as houses do that have been asked to watch. In the shifting of chairs and the courteous murmurs, some thread tightened, barely perceptible, between the portrait and the woman and those who would presently admire cold salmon in the dining room. Outside, the rain found its run along the gutter. Inside, the hyacinths were sweet to a fault. Supper proceeded with the elegant restraint of a well-scored quartet. In the dining room, panelled in pale satinwood and softened by chrysanthemums arranged with unstudied care, the guests took their places with the ease of those accustomed to the choreography of knives, forks, and conversational cues. Servants moved like shadows. Mr. Baines, the butler, grave and exact, a young parlour-maid with anxious eyelids who listened more than she looked, and Mrs. Ferris, the housekeeper, appearing briefly at the doorway to ensure the evening's machinery ran as silently as the tall clock on the landing. Mrs. Mortimer seated her guests without apparent strategy, yet with a design the attentive might have traced. Sir Reginald encountered the sea bass with as much suspicion as he brought to business, pronouncing it good only after 2 measured bites. Captain Forrester ate sparingly, occasionally looking toward Diana as if listening for a signal beyond the range of speech. The solicitor's portfolio had been removed to a side table but remained within Mr. Whitmore's line of sight, near the silver dishes and a service of decanters that were neither ostentatious nor shy of historical association. Professor Pemberton spoke little and drank claret with academic conscientiousness. It was during cheese that Mrs. Mortimer, with the authority that makes servants anticipate rather than obey, signaled for coffee in the drawing-room. They returned to that gentler light and the painted lady's untroubled gaze. Coffee arrived on a low table, a Georgian pot, a silver sugar bowl and tongs, cream in a small jug for those who would betray the bean, and on the tray's corner a little flat box of saccharine lozenges belonging to Sir Reginald, placed there by Mr. Baines as a matter of course. "I'm forbidden sugar," Sir Reginald remarked to nobody in particular, producing from his waistcoat pocket a silver case on a short chain. He tapped it, released the lid with neat fingers, and, with an absent concentration suggestive of habit, dropped a lozenge into his cup. "One discipline among others. We all have our regimes." "The discipline of taste," Mrs. Mortimer said lightly. "You and the Gainsborough would get on, both so precise." "Precision unaccompanied by honesty is merely fuss," Sir Reginald returned, "though I grant the canvas is more accommodating than most." He sipped, set the cup down, and turned to Mr. Whitmore with a look that suggested postponed business. "You brought the draft, I suppose?" Whitmore inclined his head toward the reposing portfolio. "For your inspection, Sir Reginald. There's no hurry." "On the contrary," Sir Reginald said, and then, as if correcting the tone, added, "when Eugenia's guests have been properly borne in mind." Eugenia Mortimer smiled and let silence sit a moment among them as if it were another guest, deserving civility. Diana's hand moved to her throat and then away again. Forrester leaned forward, taking up the thread with an anecdote about Bombay that had the curious quality of being both true and irrelevant. Pemberton, in a low voice to Mrs. Mortimer, asked, almost as an aside, whether the little craquelure in the corner was old or imitated. She answered him in the same register, a faint tightening at the corners of her eyes, the only distortion. Mr. Baines cleared, replenished, and finally withdrew. The mist pressed closer to the windows, and in the square the lamps wore halos. In the quiet that comes at the end of an evening, Sir Reginald stood with a careful movement and said he would step into the library for a moment to telephone the club. "Routine," he added to nobody, the word snapping lightly like the lid of his silver case. He took his cup with him, an old-fashioned gesture from an older world. He did not return with the rapidity one expects of telephones. 10 minutes became 15. Conversation thinned and then thickened around the vacancy. Whitmore's gaze, which had been faithful to his portfolio, began to wander. Forrester, after an interval, rose. "Shall I?" "No," said Diana, quickly for her, and with the slightest color. "I'll go." Her voice, when she caught it again, was properly even. "He will only scold you for fussing." She crossed the hall, her steps noiseless on the carpet runner, and opened the library door with a touch that knew the house. The library at number 9 was a thoughtful room. Books in sober bindings, a writing table whose surface was almost bare, and a single reading lamp making a clean circle of light. The air was warm and very still. Sir Reginald sat in the wing chair near the hearth, his head turned a little to the right, as if he persisted in listening to a conversation that had moved into another room. "Uncle," Diana said, not loudly. She came forward and, without quite looking, put her hand on the arm of the chair. The cup and saucer on the small table beside him were arranged with that exactness that comes naturally to those who keep their own standards. There was a faint trace of coffee on the rim, no untidy imprecision of spill. "Uncle," she said again. There was no answer. She stood very still for a moment, and then, in a motion that was both childish and well-bred, touched his sleeve and drew back her hand, as if one withdraws from a thought better not pursued. When she returned to the drawing-room, she had herself in hand. "Eugenia," she said, using the older woman's given name with a formality that acknowledged the house and its mistress. "I think Uncle is unwell." Mrs. Mortimer rose at once. Her glance went briefly to Mr. Baines, who appeared as if summoned by the angle of that look. "Ring Dr. Vesey, Baines, and go to the library at once." They went together. Mrs. Mortimer and Mr. Baines, with Captain Forrester following at a distance that was respectful and armed. The library received them with its lamplight and careful order. Mrs. Mortimer approached and stood over Sir Reginald for the space of one collected breath. Then, without haste and without display, she reached for the bell on the mantel and pressed it. "Diana," she said, turning only her head, "do sit down, my dear." It was, as deaths go, a quiet one. There was no struggle written on the face, no upset of glass or chair to suggest a last trivial anger. His hands lay as neatly as his character permitted. The silver case for his lozenges, open, caught the light with an air of small importance. The room conserved its dignity. Even the clock on the mantel considered before striking the half-hour. Dr. Vesey, summoned from Sloane Street, found them as the house found them, composed. He made the necessary observations and, in that manner which is both professional and human, allowed that sudden failures of the heart may attend those who live by measured increments. He suggested, however, as one suggests replacing a carpet runner when it has begun to fray, that the proper authorities be informed. Mrs. Mortimer inclined her head. "Baines," she said, "telephone the yard." The butler, whose face was as unreadable as old silver, bowed and went. In the drawing-room, the lady in blue silk gazed on, serene in her century, while the present moved with silent inevitability toward its next arrangement. Inspector Roderick Alleyn arrived with the quiet economy of one who disliked to intrude more than the situation demanded. The bell had scarcely ceased reverberating in the hall before Baines, with that imperturbable efficiency peculiar to superior butlers, drew the door wide and admitted him into the measured hush of number 9. There was no bustle, no scent of panic. The drawing-room lay as the first guests had found it, lamps casting their flattering circles, coals settled to a glow, the Gainsborough lady offering her eternal civility. Only the small company gathered about the Persian carpet altered the arrangement, and even they, by some tacit agreement, kept their voices to a tone that would not offend. Dr. Pembroke, the local practitioner, rose from his brief kneel beside Mrs. Mortimer and gave a small, expressive inclination of his head. "Inspector," he said, and in his voice Alleyn heard relief at surrendering responsibility to a recognized order. "I arrived 10 minutes ago. Life was extinct, had been, I should say, several minutes prior. No mark of violence. Sudden failure, heart perhaps. She had spoken of some palpitations last spring." "Thank you," Alleyn replied. He did not kneel at once. He stood instead a pace away and let the scene arrange itself for him, as scenes will for those who have learned to look without forcing their attention. Mrs. Mortimer lay as one might recline to study a picture on a low wall. The head had come gently to rest against the carpet's red field, turning the profile into relief. Fine nose, determined mouth softened now into an unaccustomed peace. One hand, with its square emerald glinting like a small hard leaf, touched lightly the easel's leg, as though she had checked herself from falling against the painting it supported. Alleyn noticed that the other hand was half-curled, not clenched. A woman who had prided herself on control had retained it to the last courtesy. He looked in the manner of a man examining a new room rather than a crime scene. The long window curtains showed no disturbance, their hems just brushing the parquet. A small occasional table near a Sheraton sofa held a wine-glass with the faintest crescent of lipstick and a few tears of wine clinging to the crystal. The bell-pull, a twist of silk that hung at an angle one shade short of geometrical perfection, seemed not to have been used. The mantel clock observed its obligations. The hands inched toward the half-hour. He went down at last and let his fingertips rest for a moment against the pulse point, with a courtesy he would not have thought necessary, but could not omit. Then he moved the lapel of the gown an inch and looked at the skin. He did not, as some would have done, sniff the lips or search the throat for bruises. He drew back and rose. "You found her so?" he asked, but his eyes were not on Dr. Pembroke. Mr. Whitmore, who had the neatness of a man whose papers never strayed from their files, inclined his head. "She faltered near the door to the dining room, Inspector. I went to her at once. There was no struggle. She made no utterance." Alleyn's glance travelled easily to each face. Sir Reginald, his silver hair making a sort of corona in the lamp's ambit, held himself very straight and very still, like a man in a club portrait whose painter has asked him not to blink. The girl, Diana, was perfectly composed. She had the look of someone who has rehearsed composure and now must perform it. Captain Forrester's stance near the windows retained the almost ridiculous precision of parade. Only his hand, an inch inside the pocket, betrayed energy without employment. Professor Pemberton was grave, observant, and faintly apart, as scholars commonly are when life becomes suddenly literal. Baines was simply what he was, the house's conscience made flesh, and therefore careful. "If I may." Alleyn touched the easel with 2 fingers, as one touches a sleeping child to be certain of breath. It had been placed well, the caster mark in the carpet told him so, and the easel's foot sat in it like a horse in a stall. Yet the crossbar bore a faint smear, not dirt exactly, but the sort of mark a ring might make if the hand were unsteady. He did not pursue the thought. "The lady," he said to the painting, almost to himself, "Gainsborough, help us all to our delusions." The words were mild and contained no mockery. He stepped back and looked at the portrait once more, then at Mrs. Mortimer's face, and then at Diana's. He noted what others had already half noted, and let it make its little chord in whatever music his mind preferred. "Dr. Pembroke," he said at last, "you will be content to make your statement that death was sudden and without external injury." "For the present," the doctor returned. "Of course, any irregularity? The police coroner?" "Quite." Alleyn smiled, and the smile made it plain that he was least of all interested in alarming anybody. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm obliged to you for sending for us. There is nothing in the circumstances to upset a household more thoroughly than a sudden death, and nothing so disagreeable as a great deal of movement. We will try to be as little troublesome as possible." He drifted a step, and his eye took in the half-drawn dining room door. Beyond, the polished table, laid, as it proved, for 7, offered silver and white porcelain and a souffle that had ceased to be itself some minutes ago. Alleyn allowed himself a fractional sigh for the cook, whose perfect timing had been defeated by mortality. "To begin," he said, "we shall keep, if you please, to our present arrangement. No one need go or telephone further for the moment. Baines, perhaps you will be so good as to see that no other callers are admitted. Sergeant Fox will be here presently. He will help me with the dreary practicalities. Dr. Pembroke, I rely on you for what must be done for Mrs. Mortimer. Sir Reginald, Miss Ashworth, Captain. Forgive me that I am a policeman. We shall sit for a little, if you agree, and be quiet." It was not a request so much as a solution offered to people who rather preferred solutions to questions. They assented with small motions. Alleyn, standing once more by the Gainsborough, folded his long hands and let the silence compose itself around them. He had found that silence, if allowed its head, will come back with something in its mouth. He looked again at the wine-glass, at the emerald ring, at the bell-pull that had not rung, and at the poised faces that had so much to lose from noise. Outside, the square exhaled mist against the windows. Inside, a policeman waited without appearing to wait at all. Alleyn suggested, with that gentle firmness which is seldom resisted in well-regulated houses, that the drawing-room remain undisturbed. The guests drifted, obedient and subdued, into the smaller morning-room, a pale green chamber lined with modest watercolors and a writing table that had, one felt, received more invitations and regrets than letters of consequence. Baines, at a nod from Alleyn, arranged a decanter and glasses on a tray he did not press upon anyone. "If we might," Alleyn said, and Mr. Whitmore, as the man who had sent for him and as one to whom people were accustomed to impart unwelcome facts, went first. Whitmore seated himself upright, the leather portfolio at his feet like a well-behaved dog. His hands were notably still. Only a discreet tightening about the mouth betrayed any inward agitation. "You are here in a professional capacity this afternoon?" Alleyn's tone suggested an appreciation of the inconveniences attendant upon private grief and public duty. "Not precisely. Mrs. Mortimer had asked me to call within the week. Some private papers were to be examined." He paused, and the solicitor's caution arranged itself between them like a screen. We had not yet begun any alteration that would necessitate formal attestation. "Yet you brought your portfolio." "A solicitor's habit, Inspector. One does not arrive unarmed." "And the nature of the papers?" Whitmore looked at his polished shoe. "I am bound by obligations that do not evaporate in the fog." She had interests of long standing, charitable as well as personal. She was a woman who prepared. "In everything," Alleyn murmured. She seemed, this evening, prepared for supper. For the first time, Whitmore's fingers tapped once, twice, on the leather lid. "She sent me a note earlier, no more than a line, postponing our appointment until after tonight. I mention it because it may be relevant, though I cannot say how." He colored faintly, as if at a breach of professional reticence. Alleyn let it rest. He asked instead about the rhythm of the evening, the conversation, the moment when Mrs. Mortimer's attention withdrew from the room. Whitmore described it plainly. He had seen no premonitory sign beyond that small abstraction before the bell-pull. Sir Reginald Ashworth followed. He took the chair by the fire as if it were a dais. His careful self-command sat upon him like a uniform. "A deplorable business, sir," he announced, in a tone that placed blame chiefly upon fate for its want of manners. "Mrs. Mortimer was a figure in our circle. I object to suddenness in any form." "You admired the Gainsborough," Alleyn observed. "Admired? Yes, though admiration is not endorsement. One has standards. The provenance is—" He sketched a small dismissive motion. "Adequate. I merely remarked that in these times a certain prudence is advisable." He glanced, almost involuntarily, toward the portfolio beyond the open door. "You and Mrs. Mortimer were at odds?" "At odds?" He frowned faintly. "We differed, as civilized people do, without declamation. She possessed an independent mind. I permit it in women if they possess it quietly." The corner of his mouth tightened. "If you ask whether there was any altercation, no. I do not raise my voice in drawing rooms." Alleyn let a breath slip into the silence. "And Miss Ashworth?" "My niece," Sir Reginald said, with that mixture of proprietorship and delicacy common to men of his sort. "She is engaged to Captain Forrester." Mrs. Mortimer knew and expressed a suitable degree of goodwill. "A suitable degree?" Sir Reginald looked at him. "We are not demonstrative people, Inspector." Diana entered like a pale figure in a watercolor, finely drawn and a little elusive. She sat without fuss, her hands flat upon her skirt, a small, precise gesture that might have calmed a far more agitated spirit than her own. "Miss Ashworth," Alleyn said softly, "you were near Mrs. Mortimer when she rose to ring." "I was on the sofa. She looked absent for a moment. I thought perhaps she had remembered a telephone call or an instruction for Baines." Her voice was measured. The slight delay before each answer might have been the stiffness of shock or the caution of breeding. "She and I had planned to speak after supper. A small matter." "Of what nature?" "I'm afraid I do not know. She said only, 'Afterwards, my dear.' She had a way of postponing that rendered one grateful instead of impatient." "You were on good terms?" "We were not intimate," Diana said, choosing carefully, "but Mrs. Mortimer took an interest in my future." Alleyn did not glance toward the windows where Captain Forrester would presently stand. He thanked her, and she rose with the ghost of a curtsy that was not a curtsy at all, but a lifetime's habit of graceful retreat. Captain Forrester came in looking as if he had been summoned to a private word with a commanding officer. He stood at ease, then, remembering civility, sat. The fog had left a trace of damp along the shoulders of his evening coat. He must have slipped to the threshold and back again. You were at the window. Yes. Why? I like a view, Inspector. One feels less enclosed. Did you notice anything out of doors? Only the fog and a cat making up its mind about the railings. Alleyn's eyes smiled. And indoors? Any remark of Mrs. Mortimer's that struck you? She asked about our plans. Forrester said after a small pause that was not quite hesitation. Travel, perhaps. I answered as one does when one has no answer certain enough to be shared in a drawing room. You implied earlier that clarity can be overrated, Alleyn said. You were speaking of engagements or of wars. Forrester's cheek twitched. He looked down at his hands. Of life, Inspector? Professor Pemberton shuffled in with scholarly dignity and a scent of old books. His concern was real and unembellished. She died as some great ladies die, he said before Alleyn could begin. With economy, we were speaking of the portrait. I may have bored everyone. I adjusted the lamp to throw less glare upon the varnish. I did not touch the canvas. You knew Mrs. Mortimer well. For many years, we shared, I think, a curiosity about the past. She had asked me, recently, to look into a question of lineage, nothing to do with money. He smiled thinly. In England, that is a distinction one must make. There was a letter I was to bring her, notes, references. I did not bring it tonight. It seemed a thing better delivered in daylight. Alleyn's glance, when he returned to the drawing room, rested for a moment upon the lamp Pemberton had adjusted and upon the easel's crossbar with its faint scratch like the hesitation of a pen. The house had stilled again. Somewhere down the passage the servant's telephone bell gave a discreet single tinkle and stopped. Baines, appearing with a shawl that no one requested, crossed to the sofa, placed it gently, and withdrew. His face was the face of a man who had rehearsed composure and found it adequate. Alleyn watched the butler's retreat with mild attention and, as Baines passed the bell-pull and did not look at it, recognized in that omission a refinement of conduct that was almost too careful. "One more word, if you please, Baines," he said pleasantly. "A small matter, quite routine." Baines inclined his head without surprise. In houses like number 9, routine was the most consequential thing in the world. Alleyn asked for the servants with the kind of courtesy that turns command into request. Baines, who seemed to anticipate the wish, conducted him below with unostentatious dignity. The passage into the regions beneath stairs had the sobering effect it always had for Alleyn. The faint warmth of ovens, the low shine of copper, the well-scrubbed boards, the sense of a machine whose smoothness depended upon 100 unrecorded adjustments. In the butler's pantry, where silver lay in ranks like a small, obedient army, Baines stood precisely at ease. He was not young. His face had the serenity that comes from a lifetime of conducting other people's emotions to their proper seats. "You were listening for the bell?" Alleyn asked. "As one does, sir. Mrs. Mortimer's bell for supper is raised at 8:30. I had the first course in readiness." A pause that might have passed for a breath. "It did not ring. So you went up?" "Not immediately, sir. One allows a minute or two by the clock. Ladies sometimes detain a point in conversation. When the silence continued beyond the proper interval, I stepped to the hall. At that moment, Mr. Whitmore called out. Baines's eyes did not falter. I went in. "You had already poured drinks this evening?" "Sherry before, sir. Amontillado for Madam and Miss Ashworth, claret for Sir Reginald. The captain took whiskey and soda. Professor Pemberton has a very light hand with sherry. He prefers to think on an empty palate." "And Mrs. Mortimer?" "A small glass, sir, as usual." Alleyn considered the "as usual." It sat between them like a small, polished fact. Any alteration in her routine today? Letters, callers, messages? Baines' pause this time contained thought. "There was a messenger in the afternoon, sir. Delivered to hand, from Bond Street. The name? I could not say, sir. Baines's tone suggested he could say, given license. The housekeeper will have entered it in the book. Mrs. Emmett, produced from a green baize door with the sober rustle of one summoned to account, brought the caller's ledger with her. She had a calm face that had learned to absorb trouble without transmitting it. Mr. Grisman, sir, she read, consulting an immaculately slanted hand. From Pilbeam and Ray, the picture dealers. Delivered an envelope. Mrs. Mortimer asked that it be brought to her writing room. She was not at home to the telephone till 6. At 6, she took 2 calls, one from Mr. Whitmore's chambers, one unrecorded. Unrecorded? Alleyn inquired mildly. The exchange could not give the origin, sir. The caller asked for Madam and would speak to no one else. It was a short conversation. Mrs. Emmett's hands were composed upon the ledger. Madam burned papers afterward. In the drawing-room grate. That is not her habit. Not her habit, Alleyn repeated, as if trying the phrase for weight. She burns correspondence elsewhere. In the small grate in her writing-room, sir. The drawing-room fire was not laid for that purpose. Baines, who had been respectfully in abeyance, now contributed with delicate dryness. I changed the ash-pan before the guests arrived, sir. There were fragments that did not belong to our firewood. Red wax. Alleyn looked from one to the other. You retain a conscientious interest in ash, Baines. One has to, sir, Baines returned, and the corner of his mouth almost moved. The lady's maid, when brought, proved to be a thin, grave woman called Pierce, of the type that carries entire wardrobes and reputations with equal discretion. She curtsied as if laying down a responsibility rather than performing a formality. You dressed Mrs. Mortimer for dinner? Alleyn asked. As usual, sir. The black with jet. She had me change the ring. The ring. She had worn the sapphire in the afternoon. She had me take the emerald from the safe. Pierce's eyes, which had the lucidity of well-kept glass, lifted and dropped. Madam said it was more suitable to the portrait. To the portrait? Alleyn allowed the echo its place. She liked to have a point of conversation, sir, Pierce said, and one could hear in the line the defense of a mistress given without fuss and with entire loyalty. The emerald sits tight in damp weather. I suggested she leave it. She would have it. Tight? A little mark, sir. Nothing to trouble. I smoothed a touch of pomatum under it. You noticed nothing else? Alleyn asked, and watched the small, almost imperceptible stiffening of the maid's hands. Madam was occupied, sir, not flurried. She asked that the blue shade be put on the standing lamp by the easel. It is usually the cream. She said the blue was kinder to the lady's skin. Kindness is a quality of light, Alleyn said. Anything from the bedchamber, bottles, draughts, that sort of thing? Dr. Pembroke had ordered her bromide of late for sleep, only at night. She would take a sniff of salts before dinner if a headache threatened. They are in the left-hand drawer of the escritoire. Was the drawer drawn this evening? I could not say, sir. I was not in the drawing-room again after dressing Madam. I went below to help with the linen. Alleyn thanked them as though he had been given largesse. When Baines had resumed his station and Mrs. Emmett her domain, he asked to see the writing-room. Baines conducted him there without comment. It was a small, correct chamber furnished for accuracy rather than comfort. The fire was laid, but not lit. On the desk lay a blotter of old-fashioned leather, the kind that takes and keeps secrets if one is patient. The grate held ash too recent to be merely decorative, and in it a bead of red wax had melted into the shape of a misplaced berry. Alleyn lifted the ash with a paper knife. A sliver of envelope remained, singed at the edge, the watermark visible when held to the light, P&W. He replaced it with the same care with which he had taken it up. In the drawing-room, a blue shade had indeed been fitted to the standing lamp. The Gainsborough lady, under this softened light, wore serenity as one might wear a veil. He stood for a moment in the doorway, his hand on the bell-pull which had not been tugged, and considered the small economies of habit on which a life like Mrs. Mortimer's rested. The proper ash in the proper grate, the correct color of a lamp, the settled hour for a bell. Somewhere in the adjustments made this evening, something had shifted beyond the domestic into the fatal. He felt it not as a discovery, but as a remembered truth, and let his hand fall. There remained a particular question to be asked, quietly and in its place. It would not be put to a guest. It would concern not what had been said in that immaculately conducted room, but what had been done before anyone spoke at all. When Alleyn returned to the drawing-room, it had acquired that museum hush which follows sudden absence. The lamps made islands of light upon polished surfaces. The Persian carpet held the careful imprint of the easel's feet, a delicate geometry upon which nothing now moved. In such rooms, he had found, objects developed the eloquence of witnesses if one only granted them courtesy enough to speak. Baines hovered at the threshold with that tactful readiness which is the greater part of superior service. At Alleyn's request, he stepped in, not to tidy, but to explain. "You keep a very steady ship, Baines." "Thank you, sir." "The evening, ordinarily, how does it run?" Baines considered without flourish. Mrs. Mortimer liked the first part of the evening confined to the drawing-room, talk, perhaps a small exhibition if she had acquired a piece. His discreet glance acknowledged the Gainsborough. And at the stroke of the half-hour she would ring. I should then serve the supper from the sideboard in the dining-room. Coffee would be taken here again, with a cordial for those who wished it. Mrs. Mortimer herself preferred a very little Benedictine, sir, 2 thimblefuls at most. And tonight she did not ring, Alleyn said, glancing at the bell pull. Its silken length, usually a line of perfect plumb, bore the faintest twist in its cord, as though an uncertain hand had turned it and then thought better of the impulse. "No, sir. I came when the half-hour struck. It was my practice, if Mrs. Mortimer delayed, not to intrude, only to be within call." Alleyn nodded. "The cordials. Where are they kept?" "In the Tantalus, sir." Baines crossed to a handsome cabinet of inlaid woods beneath the mirror. Locked, as a matter of course. He produced a small key from his waistcoat. The crystal decanters gleamed within, each with a paper collar neatly lettered in an elegant copper plate. Kümmel, Curaçao, Benedictine. On the tray beside lay the little Venetian glasses Mrs. Mortimer affected on such occasions. Pale green bowls with gilded rims like the inside of shells. Alleyn, who admired good handwriting as he admired any honest craft, ran a finger lightly over the labels. One, for Benedictine, seemed freshly written. The loops a shade less precise, the downstrokes lacking the habitual firmness of the other 2. A tiny thing, perhaps, but such households ran upon tiny things made consistent. "You write these labels yourself, Baines?" "I do, sir." A fractional pause. No more. "Or Mrs. Hesketh, the housekeeper?" In a pinch. "And tonight?" "Tonight they are as they were," Baines replied, "but not as a man who would stake his soul upon it." Alleyn replaced the collar without comment. He moved to a small lacquer table by the sofa where Diana had sat. A circular mark, a ghostly ring of moisture, lingered upon its surface, too small for a wine glass, too shallow for tea. He lifted one of the little Venetian cordial glasses from the tray and fitted it to the circle. It matched too precisely to be dismissed as coincidence. Another infinitesimal shiver of understanding went through him, not yet a conclusion, but the shape of one. "Did Mrs. Mortimer take her cordial before supper?" "Never before, sir. After the coffee, if at all." "And her coffee?" "In the dining-room, sir, served from the silver service. She disliked it being carried about." Alleyn let that rest and crossed to the mantel where the clock ticked with fastidious propriety. It stood 2 minutes ahead. Baines, noticing his glance, said, "Mrs. Mortimer always set it by the wireless each evening, sir. She would not abide a fast clock. I had not yet corrected it." Yet Mrs. Mortimer had paused to ring and had not rung, a routine shifting by one link in its chain. He looked at the easel. Its crossbar bore a faint smudge. Not dust, not polish. A darker stroke where a hand, perhaps, had steadied itself. A thread, pale and elusive, clung to a tiny splinter on the wood and trembled in the draught from the half-open door. He did not touch it. Baines, who laid the table? Mrs. Hesketh and Ivy, sir. I placed the name cards as Mrs. Mortimer directed. Alleyn walked to the dining room and stood just within. The silver shone with the high, clean light of good care. 7 placed cards in Mrs. Mortimer's own hand, clear, decided, had been arranged with that grace which makes conversation seem accidental. 1 card, for Professor Pemberton, bore the faintest trace of an erasure, as if another name had sat there an instant and been removed. The card at Mrs. Mortimer's right, where Diana would have been, had been placed a finger's breadth farther than symmetry required, enough to accommodate the little vinaigrette Mrs. Mortimer sometimes pressed into a guest's hand when headaches threatened. It sat now on the sideboard, open, its sponge faintly scented with lavender and vinegar. Someone had thought to use it, or to offer it, and then had set it tidily aside. Ritual and routine. The house expressed them without effort, a well-rehearsed piece. Tonight the steps had been subtly altered. A cordial before the bell, a clock not set, a label rewritten by a less practiced hand, a chair slid to make room for an anticipated faintness, an erased name. None of it, taken singly, amounted to declaration. Together they formed that whispering hint that Alleyn had learned to hear as clearly as a shout. He returned to the drawing-room and stood again before the portrait. The painted lady's placid gaze, so nearly Mrs. Mortimer's, regarded him with that mild indifference which old beauty reserves for the living. In the mirror above the tantalus, he saw the room reflect itself, decanting its small deceptions into order. "Baines," he said gently, "I must ask that nothing be touched, particularly the tantalus, the glasses, and the bell-pull. If anyone should request refreshment, pray offer water." "Very good, sir. And one more thing. Who has the key to the tantalus when you are below stairs?" "No one, sir." Then, after the slightest hesitation, unless Mrs. Mortimer took it herself, she would do so now and again if she wished to treat a guest without troubling the pantry. Alleyn inclined his head. "Thank you." He did not yet know what part these small departures from habit would play, only that in such households truth seldom entered by the front door. It came in, instead, through the scullery, wrapped in routine. And somewhere between the half-hour that had not been rung and the cordial that had not yet been served, a hand had moved a fraction out of time. From the hall there came a muffled sound, the scrape of the letter-box and the soft fall of envelopes upon the mat. Baines glanced instinctively toward the door, the post late with the fog. Alleyn's attention sharpened by a degree not visible to the eye. In houses like number 9, letters could be as explosive as gunfire, if one had ears for their detonation. Baines brought the late post on a small salver, 3 items only, their modest number rendered oddly consequential by the hush in which they arrived. He paused within the drawing-room, as one might pause at the edge of a sanctuary, and at a murmured word from Alleyn conveyed the letters to the morning-room where the company had again assembled with the composure of people waiting for an intermission to end. "With your permission," Alleyn said, addressing Mr. Whitmore, "these may have bearing on the present circumstances. You stand, I think, nearest to the position of trustee." Whitmore, who had schooled his face to a kind of grave impersonality, inclined his head. "If there is any question of propriety, I shall answer for it, Inspector." He glanced down and sorted the envelopes with professional fingers. A thin, cream one addressed in a delicate italic to Mrs. Mortimer, a blunt telegraph form, and a long grey envelope with a typed address to Mr. Geoffrey Whitmore himself. "The grey one first," Alleyn suggested gently. Whitmore slit it with a small paper knife. What he drew out proved to be a formal letter on headed notepaper embossed with a government crest, its language cautious and economical. As he read, his face altered not so much in expression as in texture, as if the air itself had thickened about him. "A routine acknowledgement," he said at last. The care he took with the word routine made it conspicuous. "From the registrar. Copies requested have been prepared and were dispatched this afternoon. There is mention of a delay with one entry." He replaced the letter with a neatness that suggested an effort at control, a purely administrative matter. "Your request pertains to Mrs. Mortimer's affairs?" Alleyn asked, as if inquiring after the weather. "To her instructions," Whitmore said. He did not look at Sir Reginald. He merely did not look at anyone. "No more than that at present, Inspector." "The telegram?" Alleyn inquired, as courteously as before. It was addressed to Mrs. Mortimer, sent from a club in St. James's. Whitmore handed it to Alleyn with the air of one transferring something neutral. Alleyn read aloud, without emphasis. "Request you telephone at once regarding valuation and papers. Matter urgent. F.A.L." The initials lay without explanation in the air. Professor Pemberton, hearing them, made a small sound of recognition and then contained it behind a hand placed thoughtfully at his chin. "Mr. Felix Aubrey Lancaster," he supplied when Alleyn looked his way. "An expert retained by several houses. A sound man, if occasionally categorical." Eugenia had consulted him. "About the Gainsborough?" Sir Reginald inquired with the calm politeness of one who had avoided saying precisely this an hour before. "Among other things," the professor replied. The remaining envelope was the cream one, addressed to Mrs. Mortimer in a hand that tried for elegance and nearly achieved it. Whitmore hesitated in that decent way by which scruples recommend themselves, then opened it and drew out a single folded sheet. A faint, old-fashioned scent rose as the paper moved, the ghost of violet long ago past fashion, too delicate to have come from any contemporary perfumery. "There is no letter," Whitmore said after a moment. "Only this." He passed it to Alleyn. What lay upon the paper was neither letter nor photograph, but an impression made by a soft graphite pencil rubbed across the sheet to reveal writing from a page below. A schoolboy trick, innocent in itself, yet oddly intimate. The characters thus disclosed were fragmentary, ends of letters, partial words, and not enough to form a sentence. Only two words emerged with clarity, connected and underlined as if for emphasis. "Lady in Blue." Alleyn regarded the page without comment. The pencil had been stropped to an almost surgical fineness. Whoever had made the rubbing had done so with practiced delicacy. He turned the page over. At the corner, in the same nearly elegant hand as the address, someone had written, "As agreed." There was no signature. "It might mean anything," Sir Reginald observed with studied neutrality. "It very often does," Alleyn agreed. He returned the paper to Whitmore, who folded it as one might fold a handkerchief and replaced it in its envelope. In the small silence that followed, Diana Ashworth, who had sat very straight for a very long time, let her shoulders soften by less than a degree and brought a hand to her temple. It was not a swoon, it was too elegantly controlled for that. Baines appeared with the unerring accuracy of a well-timed entrance, the vinaigrette materializing upon a little tray. "Only a momentary lightness," Diana said quickly as he offered it. The scent touched her and passed. Captain Forrester, who had risen with involuntary promptness, stood his ground apace behind her chair, an officer at an interior post. "If you would permit us, sir," Baines said to Alleyn with the faintest inclination. "The study has the telephone nearest at hand for the telegram. Mr. Whitmore, perhaps—" "Yes," Whitmore said, and rose. He might have been grateful for the errand. Might not. He did not say. Alleyn accompanied him as far as the hall, and then did not go away. The passage outside the study lay in a strip of light from a single lamp. The door stood a fraction open. Within, The respectable disorder of a room temporarily in use presented itself with decorous frankness. The blotter pulled forward, the safe closed, its dial set to some private combination. A small velvet case upon the desk, its lid raised like a paused word. Whitmore, crossing to the telephone, set down the telegram and reached for the receiver. "Exchange? St. James's 4197, please." His voice took on the leisureliness that defendants and solicitors alike employ with the post office. Alleyn stood at the desk and looked because anyone would, and because very few would know where to look. The velvet case wore the shape of its absent contents as a bed bears the shape of one who has risen. Something oval, shallow, had lain there, a miniature perhaps, or a jewel of the older sort, not fashioned to dazzle so much as to persist. On the blotter, the top sheet, turned half aside, bore the beginning of a letter in Mrs. Mortimer's hand. "My dear Geoffrey," then a line struck through, and beneath it, the deliberate letters, "Your duty." The rest had been torn away with tidy exactness. "Yes," Whitmore was saying into the instrument. "Aubrey Lancaster. Geoffrey Whitmore here. I speak from number 9. Mrs. Mortimer." He stopped, composed himself, and restated. "Mrs. Mortimer is not at liberty to telephone. You spoke of urgency." He listened, pencil in hand, and wrote 2 words upon the blotter with that small, tight script the profession learns from ledgers. "Certificate withdrawn." He replaced the receiver very gently. "Aubrey Lancaster has been obliged, pending certain representations, to withdraw a certificate of authenticity delivered to Mrs. Mortimer 2 months ago." He was unable to make himself clearer on the telephone. "Certificates," Alleyn said, "sometimes have their own curiosity." Who else knew of his certificate? Mrs. Mortimer, myself, the professor. I believe Sir Reginald had heard of it. Whitmore's face had returned to its neutral dignity, but he kept his hand upon the desk as though for balance. "We had not yet—" He stopped. "We had not yet made any declaration to the clubs and catalogues." "Quite," Alleyn said. On their return to the morning room, they found the assembly preserved almost precisely as before, though with a subtle diminution, as if a draught had touched a candle flame. Captain Forrester was absent. Baines, in answer to Alleyn's lifted eyebrow, supplied, "The captain stepped into the hall for air, sir. He asked for the door to be opened. The fog is heavy." "Very good," Alleyn said. He did not glance at the clock. He knew without looking that no more than 3 minutes had elapsed. He stood a moment longer, letting the room's arrangement resume its shape in his eye. Diana had not moved from her chair. Professor Pemberton had drifted, like a scholar following a footnote, to the little table where the cordial glasses stood. Sir Reginald had retained his position, the elder statesman of a small and awkward committee. Alleyn went to the door and looked into the hall. The front door stood ajar by a careful inch. Fog pressed softly against the fanlight like a face at a window. Somewhere, a figure moved upon the steps and then descended, the sound of it swallowed at once by the damp air. Alleyn did not call out. He closed the door with discretion and turned back. The second event, when it came, was scarcely an event at all, no more than the very faint click of metal upon metal, heard only because the house had become so intensely quiet. Baines, with a butler's instinct for the language of his own domain, looked toward the study. "Beg pardon, sir," he said to Alleyn, and crossed the hall. The safe, when they reached it, was still closed and still set, but the little brass label that covered the keyhole hung a fraction crooked upon one screw, as if a considerate hand had touched it and then remembered that touching was not quite the thing. It was not enough to declare anything. It was exactly enough to suggest. Back in the morning room, the company resumed their waiting as one resumes a pose for a second photograph. The letter with its ghostly rubbing lay within Whitmore's pocket. The telegram had been answered. The velvet case waited open upon the desk. The fog pressed more closely to the panes. Alleyn, who had the habit of letting his thoughts arrange themselves like dust settling on polished wood, allowed them to do so now. He knew, as he always knew at this point, that the shape of the thing had shifted. He would not yet name it. He would let it come to him in the way truth comes in such houses, obliquely, with good manners. When at last the house had fallen into that careful half-silence which follows the departure of shocked guests, Alleyn remained in the drawing-room, listening to the small sounds that testify to life's insistence, the quiet settling of furniture, the delicate click of cooling glass, the far-off murmur from the kitchen where Mrs. Hartwell issued practical consolations to a frightened scullery maid. The fog pressed at the window panes like an old habit. In its muffled company, his thoughts arranged themselves not in lines, but in layers, sifting down until pattern began to show through. He did not believe in sudden death without cause, not in houses like number 9 where ceremony ruled the hour. Dr. Pembroke's competent reassurance served less as conclusion than as courtesy. Ritual had been altered, that much the room itself had said, in shy admissions that required one to stoop and listen. He stood before the bell pull again. In such houses, a lady rang, a butler appeared, supper followed as certainly as a response follows a cue. Tonight, the cue had failed. The faint twist in the cord, that crystalline dust, absurdly minute, the ghost ring of a cordial glass before coffee's time. The tantalus, respectable as a vestry. A label rewritten by a hand, too conscientious not to betray its difference. A seat nudged to allow the vinaigrette. A small act that acknowledged anticipated discomfort and therefore, in its way, foreknowledge. Foreknowledge of what? A revelation, if Mrs. Mortimer's letter might be trusted. A disruption of the family chessboard. A questioning not merely of the painting's lineage, but of a person's. He remembered Professor Pemberton's remark about fictions wearing truth like an inherited shawl, and Mrs. Mortimer's own cool enquiry into whether repetition could confer legitimacy. Inheritance and identity, two words that could make civilized people behave with the energy of barbarians while preserving conversational decorum. He walked to the easel, where the smudge lay like a fingerprint of intention upon the crossbar. He imagined her hand there, the same hand that had polished the emerald to insolent brilliance. The same hand, a few minutes later, that had strayed to the bell pull and gathered on its fingertip a crystalline whisper of something it had no business to collect. He had seen that dust before, or a cousin to it in other rooms with better excuses for secrecy. It would not scream its name beneath a microscope, but it might murmur enough. He thought of each face in turn, not for what it had shown, but for what it had not. Sir Reginald, all angles and rectitude, who treated questions of provenance as a matter of national honor, whose loyalty to his niece was built on the granite of family name. Diana, with her accomplished stillness and those small betrayals of the throat and eyes that suggested a life practiced upon the surface while the depths kept their own counsel. Captain Forrester, soldierly and strained, whose parade ground discipline this evening had worked too hard to be mistaken for ease, and whose proximity to the windows awarded him nothing but the comfort of distance. Mr. Whitmore, discreet and conscious of the law's requirement to embrace fact, even when fact arrived in ugly clothing. His letter tremor less grief than the recognition of a document that would change the furniture of a house. And Professor Pemberton, who did not so much observe as annotate, and whose compassion seemed sharpened by familiarity with manuscripts that had destroyed reputations 2 centuries after their authors were safely buried. Of the household, Baines had shown him the rarest form of loyalty, the kind that withheld out of respect, yet yielded enough to save a mistress's intention from extinction. Mrs. Hartwell had spoken of resignation. Servants recognized that tone more reliably than family. Sarah had blurted truth without understanding its price. He asked Baines very quietly to lock the study and keep the key upon his person. "No one enters," he added, "without me." "Very good, sir." "And your tantalus, leave it as it is." If anyone inquires for a nightcap, recommend broth. It would be a kindness. Baines accepted the instruction as one accepts a service charge, without comment and with full comprehension. Alleyn watched him go and felt the small satisfaction of necessary orders impeccably carried out. He made a list, not upon paper, but in the precise ledger he kept behind the eyes. Motive, pressure applied by truth. Opportunity, found in the courtesy of a hostess who preferred to trouble no one for a cordial and kept a key for that purpose. Means, something that could ride politely upon ritual and arrive in silence. Something that might dust a bell pull or sweeten a thimble glass. The seating alteration. Why the erasure? To place a person near a person? Or to reposition a decanter within a hand's natural reach? The vinaigrette? Thoughtful, anticipatory, almost maternal, but for whose benefit? He did not yet draw the lines between names. He allowed them to float, as stars do before the mind supplies the constellation. To force a shape too early is to be trapped by it. He had learned that in theatres and in courts. Out in the square, a motor car coughed, failed, and fell again to silence. The fog had made islands of the lamps, each with its small aureole. In that softened world, the Gainsborough's lady seemed even calmer, as if the past, having witnessed a sufficient number of inconvenient truths, no longer troubled itself with the present's small catastrophes. Alleyn looked once at Mrs. Mortimer's emerald, where it lay like a jest that had outlived its audience. Then he rang the pantry bell with a finger that took care to touch only brass, and asked Baines to arrange for a constable at the door, a message to the yard, and a note for Dr. Pembroke requesting, if he would be so good, a more inquisitive examination than custom might dictate. "It may all come to nothing," he said, almost to himself. "But nothing in this house is rarely so well arranged." He would speak to them again, each in a key, half a tone different from before. Not yet tonight. Let the fog do its work upon their nerves. Let the dust settle. In the morning, when the rooms returned to their correct selves and the coffee smelt of reprieve, he would ask very small questions whose answers could not be rehearsed. He turned down the lamps, until the room's reflections grew honest. Somewhere between the unpulled bell and the altered label lay the thread. He had only to take it up with the delicacy one affords old silk and follow where it led, even if that path ran behind the Gainsboroughs' serene gaze and into the locked habits of a family who believed themselves impervious to revision. By late morning, the fog had thinned to a pale gauze about Cadogan Square, softening edges without quite obscuring them. Number 9 received its visitors with the same quiet propriety as on the previous evening, though the house had acquired that particular stillness which follows the removal of a presence too long habitual to be easily dismissed. Alleyn arrived punctually, having spent an early hour in such duties as his craft required, and a later one allowing his mind to settle about its fragments like dust finding natural repose. At his request, the small company reassembled in the morning room, a chamber of pale green silk that appeared designed for confidences. They seated themselves more gravely than before, as if some tacit compact had been made with sorrow to keep one's voice low and one's gestures tidy. Baines moved about with the attentive discretion that acknowledged both shock and routine. Coffee appeared with scarcely a sound. Alleyn sat a shade apart, as if to observe a play, without quite entering it. "I'm obliged to you all," he began, with that unfailing courtesy which made difficult requests seem almost like compliments. There remained certain formalities, and a few points of order that would be served by clarity rather than haste. If you could be so kind as to confirm your movements yesterday afternoon, merely to complete the picture. The confirmations, when they came, carried that careful naturalness which in certain circles is the only permissible disguise. Sir Reginald had been at his club until 6. "Bridge with the usual men, Inspector. We keep an orderly rubber." Mr. Whitmore had been at his chambers, receiving clients and composing letters, one of which now weighed upon them all. Professor Pemberton had gone from a lecture at the British Museum to a light tea and then direct to number 9. A worthy scone, Inspector, though it will not live in the memory. Captain Forrester spoke with military brevity of a walk along the embankment and a return to dress, while Miss Ashworth mentioned an appointment with her dressmaker in Sloane Street before joining her aunt in good time. Alleyn received these statements with neither credulity nor doubt, only that attentive quiet which is its own pressure. He made no move to set them at variance with one another. If he noted the small discrepancies of time that arise inevitably when routine is recounted under strain, he allowed no sign of it to disturb the room's careful equilibrium. "Thank you," he said at length, and closed his notebook as if ending a wholly unremarkable minute. "I should like presently to speak with each of you again, briefly and in private, if you can indulge me." There was a murmured assent. He allowed the collective to dissolve of its own accord. Sir Reginald and the Professor found themselves together over the question of museum catalogues. Whitmore stood by the window, more absorbed than one expects of a man looking merely at trees. Captain Forrester strode soundlessly to the fireplace and stationed himself by it with the air of a man guarding an outpost. Alleyn's attention returned to Diana. "Miss Ashworth, a word, if you please." She complied with that composed readiness which well-bred girls learn to supply when the occasion admits of no demurral. In the smaller sitting room beyond, where the light fell kindly upon modest watercolors of English hedgerows, she took a chair by the window and folded her hands with a delicacy that declared them steady. "You are very brave," Alleyn observed, without warmth and without the least trace of condescension. "It is a useful quality, though sometimes an exacting one." She looked at him then with that clear, unstartled gaze which is not, in fact, the same thing as innocence. "I hope I shall be found useful, Inspector. It is what women are asked to be, is it not?" He allowed the faintest smile. "Sometimes. Your aunt, Mrs. Mortimer, intended last night to speak with you privately." "She said so," Diana replied. "She said it would be after the business of supper was decently concluded." She chose her words with art. "She often did," Alleyn returned. "Did she give you any indication of the topic?" Diana's gaze drifted toward the pale strip of sky above the square. Her hand moved to her throat, and for the first time he saw the small oval of blue enamel that lay there on a fine gold chain. She did not touch it, but the lacuna of that restraint told him as much as a caress. "She suggested," Diana said at last, "that certain matters are improved by daylight, that what one can endure at noon might prove less manageable at midnight. I gathered the subject would be practical." "Practical," Alleyn repeated gently. "A good word for a hard thing." He paused. "You are fond of the portrait." "I am fond of its poise," she said after the smallest hesitation. "A calm face is sometimes the only kindness one can offer." "And of Mrs. Mortimer's ring?" he asked, not looking at her, but at the modest watercolors, as though the hedgerows held his exclusive attention. "You polished it, I think, when you were a child." A fractional intake of breath, so slight that only very quiet rooms hear such things. "She minded its brilliance," Diana said. "She said it must earn its place." Alleyn inclined his head as one might to an apt line in a book. "If I were to propose, quite without insistence, that Mrs. Mortimer had prepared some document of consequence, meant for you or about you, would that frighten you?" "It would relieve me," she said with a candor that was, paradoxically, a form of discretion. "I am tired of feeling as if everyone were about to be kind." He rose. She did not. "You have been patient with me. One more indulgence. Ask Captain Forrester to remain after luncheon. I should value a walk with him, 10 minutes only. We shall discuss soldierly matters." A shade of color visited her face and left it no different. "He will be here." "Thank you." He opened the door and stood aside for her to pass. At the threshold she paused, not turning, and said with a composure that was almost an apology, "Aunt Eugenia disliked scenes." "So do I," Alleyn answered, and closed the door very gently. In the morning room, the others had drawn themselves into their natural constellations. Alleyn spoke lightly to Sir Reginald of clubs and to Mr. Whitmore of the admirable punctuality of messengers in fog. He asked Professor Pemberton a question about the fashion in late 18th century miniatures that produced a brief, illuminating lecture on the uses of likeness. If he saw the quick, involuntary glance Sir Reginald cast at Diana during the professor's remarks, he made no sign that it had interested him at all. "Baines," he said as the company dispersed for luncheon, "we shall be very quiet here this afternoon. If any letters come by hand, pray bring them to me at once." "Certainly, sir." He stood for a moment in the pale green room after they had gone, attentive to nothing that could be named. The house had resumed its exquisite poise, yet somewhere behind the economy of their words, a decision had been taken. It would show itself presently, not with triumph, but with the tired courtesy that attends inevitable things. The following afternoon drew a thin, watery light across Cadogan Square, as if London, with due consideration, had chosen not to pry. In number 9, the blinds were half lowered, and the fire made a discreet, companionable sound. Alleyn asked that the company, diminished and subdued, assemble once more in the morning room. He had the air of a courteous guest bringing an unwelcome but necessary message. Baines attended with quiet competence. At Alleyn's request, he set upon a side table 3 small objects beneath a folded napkin. The butler, understanding a signal almost before it was given, stepped back and stood in that precise attitude of service which conveyed both presence and invisibility. Alleyn allowed a pause, long enough to acknowledge absence, short enough not to be theatrical. "I am grateful to you all," he said. "Mrs. Mortimer's doctor will, I think, have little to add to the visible fact of death, but the manner of it requires clarity. I fear we must admit that what occurred here last evening was arranged." No one moved. Sir Reginald's shoulders set a fraction. Diana's hands, lying one upon the other, pressed almost imperceptibly. Captain Forrester looked toward the window as if a parade ground horizon might steady the room. Mr. Whitmore's gaze rested with professional sadness upon the carpet. Professor Pemberton's fingers, steepled, made an ecclesiastical triangle against his chin. Mrs. Mortimer, Alleyn continued, kept her house by ritual. In such economies, the smallest departure speaks. She did not, as Baines has told us, take a cordial before coffee. Yet a cordial glass stood ready in an unlikely place. A fresh label appeared on the Benedictine, and the bell, which should hang as a plumb line, wore a faint twist with a trace, so slight as to be almost nothing of crystalline residue upon the silk. The same trace lay upon Mrs. Mortimer's right forefinger. He lifted the napkin. Upon the linen stood innocently a Venetian cordial glass. Beside it, a sliver cut from the bell-pull's silk, kept between plates of glass, and a small, unremarkable envelope such as might contain seeds. "The cordial," he said gently, "was a feint. The label, an irrelevance. Mrs. Hesketh rewrote it last week after a small spill. The bell, however, is another matter. Our hostess would ring, always at the half hour. Last night she touched the cord and the thing was done." Professor Pemberton murmured, not quite to the room. "Contact rather than draught." "Yes," said Alleyn. "There are substances, extracts, that enter as easily through skin as through courtesy. Aconitine is one. It comes to us under the respectable guise of herbalism, embrocation, even garden virtue. Monkshood may be handsome in a border, but it asks for respect." His tone remained almost conversational. "Dusted upon silk, it leaves little mark and waits with the patience of a herbarium. It requires foreknowledge of habit. One must be quite sure who will pull the bell at past." He turned his head slightly toward Baines. "You will recall, perhaps, the moment before the guests repaired here, when a log shifted and threw a little shower of sparks." Baines inclined his head. "Sir Reginald was good enough to raise the guard, sir. I went for the brush and pan. In that minute, Alleyn said without emphasis, a person, acquainted with the household's clockwork, had the room and its devices to himself. Sir Reginald's hand found his watch and closed over it. No one spoke. The silence in such rooms can be a mercy. Mrs. Mortimer had written to Mr. Whitmore, Alleyn went on, of matters touching identity and inheritance, and to Mr. Aubrey Lancaster of the painting's authentication. She had, I think, placed behind that serenity of hers a packet of documents. Her morning was spent with the safe, and, if I read the frame aright, the back of the Gainsborough had been lifted and refastened more than once. She meant to act at once. Her action would, among other consequences, expose the painting as a deception and revise an arrangement that had protected a name. He looked briefly at Diana. "Miss Ashworth, forgive me. This touches you. Your welfare concerned Mrs. Mortimer more than any question of art. She intended no scandal. She intended formality, a correction, a sheltering acknowledgement long deferred. The method of revelation might have proved trying, but it was to be legal and clean." Sir Reginald's voice, when it came, was bone dry. "You speak with certainty, Inspector." "I speak with enough certainty to spare Miss Ashworth a public rummaging. The letter to Mr. Whitmore is plain. The erased place card at Professor Pemberton's seat suggests a last-minute rearrangement to place a witness of character at her right hand. Sir, you watched the time. Sarah observed it. Baines did not, because he would never presume. You questioned the painting's virtue with some vigor, and you had reason. The loss of face, for a collector, can be as mortal as any writ. There is, too, the matter of your niece's future. You have guarded it with an exactness that is nearly love." Sir Reginald's fingers left the watch and very deliberately aligned the crease of his trouser. "And the envelope?" Alleyn touched it with the gentlest of gestures. "From your coat in the hall, Sir Reginald. Baines, being scrupulous, does not search pockets. He does, however, shake out ash. In doing so, he found this fallen into the lining and brought it to me without comment. It held, not seeds, but a dust lacking the courtesy to remain whole when handled. I will ask no chemist to pronounce what we two already know." For a moment, Sir Reginald stared beyond them, as if reading a ledger no one else could see. The old soldier stood to attention. Then, with a small concession to the room's humanity, he sat again. "I meant," he said, "to spare the girl. Eugenia's sense of virtue was admirable and, at times, satanic. She would have ripped a tapestry to show its right side. There is a barbarity in that. She had no right to throw my niece to the wolves of speculation. The picture, yes, a damned foolish purchase. I warned her. The other matter—" His voice altered, not softening but lowering. "You think me a monster. I am a guardian." Diana rose, very quietly, then sat again, as if to acknowledge that a movement of the body could not easily remedy what words had done. Alleyn inclined his head. "I think you a man accustomed to command, who mistook fatality for necessity. Mrs. Mortimer, had she lived, would have made the same admission of her own dominations. There is this difference. She intended to set in order. You, to prevent it." Sir Reginald's mouth made something that was not a smile. "I intended to frighten her. A reprimand given by nature can be salutary." "Nature," said Alleyn with grave politeness, "is an indifferent disciplinarian. It does not grade its lessons." A very small sound came from the fireside. Diana's breath. Forrester's hand, once more, made a soldier's fist upon his knee and released. Whitmore, who had remained still throughout, spoke as if offering a stipulation to the court. "Inspector, if certain papers can be placed in my charge, I will see that what Mrs. Mortimer intended, within reason and with proper protections, may proceed without noise." "Thank you," said Alleyn. "That, I think, is what she wished." He rose. "Sir Reginald, I will not ask you for a statement here. There is a carriage from the yard. We shall go out by the area steps, if you please." He turned, not to the prisoner, but to Diana. "Miss Ashworth, your name is not diminished by a correction honestly made. It is, perhaps, enlarged." Sir Reginald stood. He did not look at his niece. He glanced instead at the portrait on its easel, with that old connoisseur's instinct that seeks refuge in form when substance fails. "A poor thing," he said, "and mine own doing." It was not clear whether he spoke of the painting, the plot, or his long career of guardianship. Baines, with the tact of a sacristan, opened the door and stood aside. The house received and let go with the same discretion. When the outer air touched them, it came in thin and cold and decent. Alleyn remained a moment longer with Whitmore and Pemberton. He looked at the bell, now a mere cord and brass, innocent as a toy. "Our lives," he said, "are often no more than a sequence of courteous habits. Someone who knows the steps may direct the dance." In the dining room, the little vinaigrette, with its sponge of lavender and vinegar, waited patiently beside a place card set a finger's breadth awry. Waiting became in this house a kind of memorial. The next hour would bring its formalities, the next day its papers. But for the length of a breath, number 9 rested in a quiet that was almost mercy, and in that quiet the shape of truth settled, at last, like dust. Sir Reginald left number 9 in the early afternoon, neither concealed nor displayed. The police car waited with a tact that suggested a sedan rather than a van. Alleyn had insisted upon it. Baines, grave beyond criticism, brought the baronet's hat and stick and stood by while his master, in an old-fashioned gesture, thanked him for his years of service. The exchange was unremarkable, except for a single alteration in cadence, an extra heartbeat between words that told of everything now broken and everything preserved. The coroner's inquest, convened with commendable speed, proved decorous and economical. Dr. Pembroke spoke to the absence of natural cause. A Home Office analyst to the presence of aconitine in quantities sufficient to silence even a woman of strong constitution. The bell pull, the ring, the ritual, each detail was set down without flourish. Professor Pemberton, summoned as to character, supplied a measured account of Mrs. Mortimer's integrity and the tenor of her recent research. Mr. Whitmore offered the most limited account consistent with truth, trusting to Alleyn's nod to keep certain names from the record until they must be given. The jury, sober men whose instincts inclined toward plain verities, returned the only verdict possible: willful murder against Sir Reginald Ashworth. The thing was done, and yet not ended. In Whitmore's chambers later that day, the solicitor produced a packet sealed in Eugenia Mortimer's hand and dated 2 days prior to her death. "To be opened in the event of my decease, natural or otherwise," the inscription read. An odd phrase, both precise and, as events had made it, prophetic. The contents were brief, humane, and devastating in their implications. She set out the facts she had discovered regarding Diana, wrote of her intention to spare the girl public scandal, and enclosed a draft codicil, already witnessed, settling a modest annuity upon Mrs. Diana Forrester, formerly resident in Bombay, conditional upon her withdrawal from London society and the surrender of certain personal effects attached to the Ashworth name. She appended a private note, in a hand grown suddenly warmer, offering the emerald for sale toward your maintenance if necessity presses, with the counsel that truth travels more safely when it goes lightly burdened. Whitmore's voice, when he finished, had flattened into that tonelessness by which Englishmen disguise feeling. "You see, Inspector, it was all quite unnecessary." "That," said Alleyn, studying the ruled lines upon Whitmore's blotter as if they might yield a kinder geometry, "is often the worst of it." The Gainsborough, too, yielded its verdict. Felix Aubrey Lancaster's final report, delivered with academic tact, pronounced the picture a late 18th century pastiche of undeniable charm and no great merit, a caprice by a gifted imitator. The painting, which had presided so serenely over the evening of revelations, returned to its status as elegant misapprehension. Its market value declined accordingly. Its symbolic value, if anything, increased. Professor Pemberton, who came to say goodbye to the lady in blue, regarded her with mild sympathy. "We have imposed too much upon your serenity," he murmured, and went away with a scholar's sad amusement. Captain Forrester presented himself at Whitmore's office with parade ground punctuality. His statement was meticulously truthful as to dates and insufficiently explanatory as to motives. He would not claim, he said, what was not his. His marriage existed, regrettable in its circumstances, but not to be disclaimed. He would resign his club and apply for overseas service. War, which had hovered at the edge of everyone's horizon, now offered him a future unencumbered by drawing-room inquiries. Alleyn thought him sincere and insufficient. The mixture was not uncommon. Diana, no longer Ashworth by any permissible fiction, came to number 9 once more at Whitmore's request. Baines admitted her without alteration of manner. She wore a dark coat of excellent cut and carried no jewels. In the morning room, where a little coal fire had been laid, Whitmore read her Eugenia's letter. She listened with that intent stillness which had distinguished her even in performance, and when he finished, she took the codicil and placed it upon the table without touching it further. "She was kinder than any of us deserved," she said after a pause. "I will sign what is necessary. You understand the conditions?" "Yes." She glanced toward the window, where the square, cleansed of fog by a brittle autumn wind, showed itself with unforgiving clarity. "I shall go to a place where truth can be quieter. There is a small cottage in Dorset. Someone I knew in India lets it out in winter. The annuity will suffice. I shall not trouble London again." "Captain Forrester?" Whitmore inquired with the dryness of a man who refuses the luxury of hope. "He will be spared any association with me henceforward," she said, not unkindly. "He has his profession. I shall have my quiet." She rose and hesitated, then added, "Please tell Baines, if it is not improper, that I was grateful for his civility." Alleyn, who had stood by the grate and watched the small fire burn with admirable economy, walked with her as far as the hall. "If you are ever asked," he said, "remember that silence is not always complicity. Sometimes it is mercy." She met his look with that frank steadiness he had noticed on the first evening. "I am learning to distinguish between them." Sir Reginald, meanwhile, made his arrangements with the same punctiliousness he had brought to everything. He wrote 2 letters, one to his club, requesting the quiet settlement of his account, one to Whitmore, directing a small bequest to Mrs. Hartwell for services above the ordinary, and an expression of confidence in Baines. He gave no explanation, asked no favor, and submitted himself when the day came with a soldier's acceptance of a command he did not admire. The house itself began its transformation from private stage to probate inventory. Baines conferred with Whitmore over lists. The Tantalus was locked and labeled. The emerald, wrapped in tissue, passed into the solicitor's charge. Mrs. Hartwell measured out flour with the dry-eyed concentration of skilled hands busy at dull work. Sarah carried fires with an anxious exactness that suggested both penitence and relief. The rooms acquired that faint echo, peculiar to houses, from which a principal voice has departed. Alleyn, who disliked lingering in places where justice had been successfully invoked and no longer required his presence, nevertheless walked once more through the drawing-room. The portrait remained. Its removal would require trustees, decisions, some polite quarreling. He stood before the lady in blue and noted, not for the first time, how nearly she resembled Eugenia, and how much the resemblance had ceased to matter. The square beyond the window lay bright and cold. A gust lifted the last of the fog like a curtain. He felt the case settling, a pattern complete enough to satisfy the coroner, never quite sufficient to reconcile the living. There remained only the small courtesies that close such affairs, a word to the servants, a line to the expert, the final signature upon the property seals. He took up his hat. Outside, the afternoon had the hard polish of a new coin. Justice, such as it was, had been set in motion. The irony that Eugenia's mercy, had it been allowed its way, would have spared them all, persisted like a faint, elegant perfume in rooms no longer occupied. He thought of it as he stepped into the square and turned toward the waiting car, saving, as was his habit, anything resembling conclusion for a quieter hour.